They don't have the great lifespan of the Númenóreans, nor high lineage of men who fought against Morgoth. Yet their stories of overcoming adversity are among the greatest in all Middle-earth. From their early days in the north to fighting for the very survival of men in the War of the Ring, time and again they would show their resilience and bravery. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the complete history of the Rohirrim. The oldest ancestors of the Rohirrim actually shared a common ancestry with the Dunedain. Both were believed to be descended from the Edain of the First Age. While the Edain would cross the Ered Luin, befriend the elves, and take part in the wars against Morgoth, the Northmen did not. They would remain in the lands of Rhovanion. We don't know much of their time during the First and Second Ages of Middle-earth. Their tale truly begins in the Third Age. Our story begins in the aftermath of the Great Plague of 1635. As mentioned in my video on the Wars of the Witch King and Arnor, this plague was severe for the people of Rhovanion. In fact, it was so bad that they lost half of their population. 200 years later, in 1851, the Wainrider invasions begin, and the Northmen of Rhovanion get the worst of these first assaults. The Wainriders are a tribe of Easterlings, known for their battle chariots. In 1856, King Narmakil II of Gondor takes a great army north to the plains south of Mirkwood, and gathers together what he can of the remnants of the Northmen. The Wainriders descend upon the Gondorians. The battle is a disaster for Gondor. King Narmakil is killed, as well as the leader of the Northmen, Marhari. Gondor's army retreats over Dagorlad and into Ithilien. With the exception of Ithilien, Gondor abandons the lands east of the river Anduin. While this Battle of the Plains does enough damage to the Wainriders to prevent them driving deeper into Gondor, they have strength enough to conquer the men of Rhovanion. This results in the Northmen becoming even more geographically divided. Some flee over the Kelduin River and merge with the people of Dale. Some take refuge in Gondor. Some gather under the leadership of Marhari's son, Marwini. Marwini leads his people north between the Anduin and Mirkwood, settling in the Vales of Anduin between the Carrick and the Gladden Fields, not far from where Smeagol would live during his hobbit upbringing nearly 600 years later. Over the next 40 years, many of the men of Rhovanion would be enslaved by the Wainriders. Marwini is joined by many fugitives coming through Mirkwood, whose land was taken by the Wainriders. Marwini becomes the first lord of this new civilization of men, the eotheod. This name in Old English meaning horsefolk. In 1899, Marwini discovers that the Wainriders are planning a raid on Calenarthon, a large area in the northern portion of Gondor. Marwini sends word to Gondor, warning King Kalimetar of an impending attack. In a masterstroke, Kalimetar provokes the Wainriders out of Ithilien. Joined by a large Eored, led by Marwini, he drives the Wainriders back. Meanwhile, outlaws and roused slaves burn many of the Wainriders' settlements in Rhovanion. The Wainriders are driven back to the east. Marwini leads the Northmen back to the lands beside the Anduin, and the Northmen never return to their former homes. Later, Marwini's son, Forthwini, succeeds him as the Lord of the eotheod. Through his spies, Forthwini learns that the Wainriders have recovered and are allying themselves with other forces in the east. He alerts King Ondoher of Gondor of this growing threat. In 1944, these enemies of Gondor make a double assault. The Haradrim invade from the south, and within a few days, the Wainriders attack from the east. King Ondoher gives Eärnil II command of Gondor's southern army to combat the Haradrim, while taking lead of the larger northern army himself. The Wainriders move quicker than anticipated and reach Gondor's northern army along the outskirts of the Ered Lithwi, rather than in Dagorlad. The enemy's chariots and horsemen overwhelm the king's guard and kill Ondoher and his son, Ardomir. His son Faramir would die in the battle as well, having secretly come to battle against his father's wishes. The forces of Gondor and the Eotheod suffer severe losses and retreat. The Wainriders, having won a great victory, make camp in North Ithilien and celebrate their conquest. Little did they realize how drastically their fates would be reversed. For Eärnil and his southern army had been victorious over the Haradrim, destroying their army in South Ithilien, and after his victory, Eärnil had turned north. Eärnil's army, joined by the fleeing members of Gondor's northern army, descend upon the unprepared Wainriders. Many are driven into the swamplands of the Dead Marshes. As a result, the Easterlings would not march against Gondor for hundreds of years. Eärnil is crowned King of Gondor, and in 1973, he receives word that Arthedain is about to be attacked by the Witch King of Angmar. He sends his son Eärnur with a fleet of Gondorian forces. It is also said that a certain group of tall and fair riders on special horses, princes of Northmen, join these Gondorian forces in defeating the Witch King and driving him from Eriador. 2 years after the fall of Angmar, Lord Frumgar leads the Eotheod to a new land north of Mirkwood, between the Misty Mountains and the Forest River, far away from the lands ravaged by the Easterlings and orcs. The region itself comes to be known as Eotheod, named for the people who settled the land. The remainder of Frumgar's reign continues without any notable events recorded in history. His son Fram, however, would become one of the few men to come face to face with a dragon. He was so influential that the main settlement of the region would be named after him, Framsburg. During Fram's rule as Lord of the Eotheod in the late 20th and early 21st century of the Third Age, a dragon known as Scatha the Worm plagued his people. While we don't know much about Scatha, we know that he possessed a great treasure hoard in the Grey Mountains, which he had stolen from the dwarves. After his people had been troubled by the dragon for some time, Fram kills Scatha sometime around 2000 of the Third Age, and lays claim to the dragon's treasure. The dwarves of the Grey Mountains, where Thror would be born hundreds of years later, also lay claim to the hoard. Fram rebukes their claim, and instead sends them the teeth of the dragon, along with a message. Jewels such as these you will not match in your treasuries, for they are hard to come by. It is rumored that the dwarves killed Fram for this insult. However, the men of the Eotheod kept at least some of the treasure, as one of the items was the very horn which Éowyn would gift to Merry after the War of the Ring, and he would in turn use it to rouse the hobbits in the Battle of Bywater. Nearly 400 years after the time of Fram, Leod is lord of the Eotheod. He is known as a great horseman, and during his rule, he captures a white foal who is both wild and proud. When the horse is full grown, Leod attempts to break the horse, but is thrown off. His head strikes a rock, and he is killed at the age of 42. The lordship passes to his son, Eorl, who is just 16 years old at the time. Eorl swears to avenge his father. He hunts down the horse, demanding the horse give up his freedom in payment for the death of his father. The horse, who could understand the speech of men, agrees. Eorl names him Felarof, the first of the Meras, and the great ancestor of Shadowfax. Years later, in 2510, Lord Cirion, the ruling steward of Gondor, receives word that hosts of men are mustering along the southern edge of Mirkwood, with plans to invade Gondor. Cirion sends 6 volunteer riders to attempt the 950-mile journey through Calinarthon, over the Undeeps, and past the shadow of Dol Guldur to ask their friends of old, the Eotheod, for aid. Of the 6, only a single Gondorian rider manages to make it all the way to Framsburg. The rider, Barondir, presents Lord Eorl with the red arrow and the seal of the stewards. This is the first mention of the red arrow, the method which Gondor would use to summon its allies in times of need. Barondir informs Eorl that the weakened realm of Gondor, now kingless for nearly 500 years, has been attacked by the Balkoth, a fierce group of Easterlings. Eorl takes Barondir as a guide and assembles a great eoher, a term meaning a full muster of their armed riders. They make their way from Framsburg through the eastern vales of Anduin, and as they approach the southern portion of Mirkwood, they keep as far to the west as possible to avoid the darkness of Dol Guldur. In Unfinished Tales, it says, Eorl did not halt. "Ride on," he commanded. "There is no other way to take. After so long a road shall we be held back from battle by a river mist." As they drew nearer, they saw that the white mist was driving back the glooms of Dol Guldur, and soon they passed into it, riding slowly at first and warily. But under its canopy all things were lit, with a clear and shadowless light, while to the left and right they were guarded, as it were, by white walls of secrecy. "The Lady of the Golden Wood is on our side, it seems," said Barondir. "Maybe," said Eorl, "but at least I will trust the wisdom of Felaroth. He scents no evil. His heart is high, and his weariness is healed. He strains to be given his head. So be it, for never have I had more need of secrecy and speed." Then Felaroth sprang forward, and all the host behind followed like a great wind, but in a strange silence, as if their hooves did not beat upon the ground. So they rode on, as fresh and eager as on the morning of their setting out, during that day and the next. But at dawn of the third day, they rose from their rest, and suddenly the mist was gone, and they saw that they were far out in the open lands, and on their right the Anduin lay near, but they had almost passed its great eastward loop, and the Undeeps were in sight. It was the morning of the 15th day of Virese, and they had come there at a speed beyond hope. Indeed, Barondir was correct in his assessment. Galadriel herself had conjured the mist, allowing them to pass through the land with speed, avoiding the shadow of Dol Guldur. The Balcoth, who were under the sway of Dol Guldur, had crossed the Anduin River with the assistance of orcs from the Misty Mountains, and invaded Gondor's sparsely populated northern realm of Calenarthon. Because this area had been mostly abandoned long before, the Balcoth met little resistance. By the time the northern army of Gondor appears from the fortresses of Isengard, Aglarond, later known as Helm's Deep, and other fortresses in the White Mountains, most of the Balcoth army has already crossed into the Wold, the northeastern part of Calenarthon, just east of Fangorn Forest. The North Army, led by Cirion, counterattacks and is driven into the Wold, cut off from later reinforcements by the Balcoth army. By the time the Southern Army appears, the North Army is under attack by a band of orcs from the Misty Mountains. The Gondorians are now backed against the river in a hopeless situation. At this time, surprising both friend and foe, Lord Eorl appears, bringing with him 7,000 fully armed riders and several hundred horsed archers. The eotheod cross the Anduin at the Undeeps of the river and break upon the rear guard of the Balcoth. The Balcoth army is nearly completely destroyed, and the Gondorian armies are saved. The eotheod continue making their way into northern Gondor, scattering and destroying all the Balcoth in Calenarthon. Before parting, Cirion asks Eorl to meet him in 3 months upon the banks of the Mering stream. "Farewell now, Eorl, son of Leod. I will return to my home, where much needs to be set in order. Calenarthon I commit to your care for this time, if you are not in haste to return to your own realm. In 3 months' time, I will meet you here again, and then we will take counsel together." "I will come," Eorl answered, and so they parted. When they meet again 3 months later, Cirion had cleared the overgrown path up Aman Anwar, and the two men with their parties ascend the hill. Before they reach the top, Cirion reveals his resolution. He offers to Eorl the land of Calenarthon for him and his people, in perpetual alliance with Gondor. Eorl accepts, in acknowledgement of Cirion's wisdom and friendship. At the foot of the stair there was a small shelf or cove made in the hillside with low turf banks. There the company sat for a while, until Cirion rose, and from his esquire took the white wand of office and the white mantle of the stewards of Gondor. Then standing on the first step of the stair, he broke the silence, saying in a low but clear voice, "I will now declare what I have resolved, with the authority of the stewards of the kings, to offer to Eorl, son of Leod, Lord of the Eotheod, in recognition of the valor of his people and of the help beyond hope that he brought to Gondor in time of dire need. To Eorl, I will give in free gift all the great land of Calenarthon, from Anduin to Eisen. There, if he will, he shall be kind, and his heirs after him, and his people shall dwell in freedom while the authority of the stewards endures, until the great king returns. No bond shall be laid upon them other than their own laws and will, save in this only: they shall live in perpetual friendship with Gondor, and its enemies shall be their enemies, while both realms endure. But the same bond shall be laid also on the people of Gondor. Then Eorl stood up, but remained for some time silent, for he was amazed by the great generosity of the gift, and the noble terms in which it had been offered. And he saw the wisdom of Cirion both on his own behalf as ruler of Gondor, seeking to protect what remained of his realm, and as a friend of the Eotheod, of whose needs he was aware. For they were now grown to a people too numerous for their land in the north, and longed to return south to their former home, but they were restrained by the fear of Dol Guldur. But in Calenarthon they would have room beyond hope, and yet be far from the shadows of Mirkwood. Yet beyond wisdom and policy, both Cirion and Eorl were moved at that time by the great friendship that bound their people together, and by the love that was between them as true men. On the part of Cirion, the love was that of a wise father, old in the cares of the world, for a son in strength and hope of his youth. While in Cirion, Eorl saw the highest and noblest man of the world that he knew, and the wisest, on whom set the majesty of the kings of men of long ago. At last, when Eorl had swiftly passed all these things through his thought, he spoke, saying, "Lord Steward of the great king, the gift that you offer I accept for myself and for my people. It far exceeds any reward that our deeds could have earned, if they had not themselves been a free gift of friendship. But now I will seal that friendship with an oath that shall not be forgotten." "Then let us go now to the high place," said Cirion, "and before these witnesses take such oaths as seem fitting." The group continues their climb, and upon reaching the summit, Cirion reveals the tomb of Elendil. The tomb of Elendil was built by Isildur at the beginning of the Third Age, and had been kept secret for well over 2,000 years. Only the kings and stewards of Gondor knew of its location and had the right to approach it. Before his son Halas, the prince of Dol Amroth, and 2 other counselors of Gondor as witnesses, Cirion pledges his bond with Eorl. In return, Eorl swears the oath of Eorl and becomes the first king of Rohan. "Hear now all peoples who bow not to the shadow in the east. By the gift of the Lord of Mundburg, we will come to dwell in the land that he names Calenarthon. And therefore I vow in my own name, and on behalf of the Eotheod of the north, that between us and the great people of the west, there shall be friendship forever. Their enemies shall be our enemies. Their need shall be our need. And whatsoever evil or threat or assault may come upon them, we will aid them to the utmost end of our strength. This vow shall descend to my heirs, all such as may come after me in our new land, and let them keep it in faith unbroken, lest the shadow fall upon them and they become accursed." In addition to his oath, Cirion speaks an invocation in Quenya and the common speech, calling the Valar and Eru to witness the oaths that were taken. "Vandasina, Termaruva, Elena Noreo Alcar Enyalien, ar Elendil Vorondo Voronwe, Nai Tiruvantes I Harar, Mahalmasen Minumen, ar I Eru, I O Ilie Malhalmar, Ea Tenoyo." This oath shall stand in memory of the glory of the land of the star, and of the faith of Elendil the faithful, in the keeping of those who sit upon the thrones of the west, and of the one who is above all thrones, forever. Eorl leaves half his army behind, and takes the other half north to Eotheod, bringing those who had stayed behind to their new home in Calenarthon. Along with the land itself, these men, now known as the Rohirrim, inherit 2 long-abandoned Gondorian structures. In the White Mountains there is a fortress known as the Soothburg, built in the glory days of Gondor. There is also Dunharrow, a refuge whose origins trace back to the Druidine of the Second Age. Worth noting is a third structure at the northernmost border of their new land, the Tower of Orthanc. The former two of these structures would be restored and put to use by the Rohirrim. None of these, however, would be used as the capital of Rohan. Instead, Eorl would build the city of Aldburg in the eastern part of Rohan's central region known as the Fold. Rohan as a country is divided into different regions. The West March is the only portion of Rohan that lies to the west of the White Mountains. Between the River Eisen and the River Entwash is the Westimnet. The Eastimnet lies between the Entwash and the Great River Anduin. These regions make up the Great Plains of Rohan. While there would be some settlements of people in these regions, it is common for Rohirrim herdsmen to live as nomads as they drive their herds across the grasslands. Within the northernmost portion of the Eastimnet, we find the Wold, the least populated area of the kingdom, and the area that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli would traverse in pursuit of the orcs carrying Merry and Pippin. Along the White Mountains is where we find the most populated areas of Rohan, the West Fold, the East Fold, and between them, the Fold. Eorl would rule from Aldburg as the first king of Rohan for 35 years, and despite growing old, he would never lose his yellow hair. In 2545, he would ride into battle against the Easterlings, once again invading the Wold. He would die in battle at the age of 60. He and his horse Felarof, who also fell in the battle, would be buried in the first royal mound. These mounds, like the hill where Elendil had been buried, were covered in alfarin, white flowers called by the Rohirrim symbol Muna. The kingship passes to Eorl's son Brego, who continued overseeing the migration of his people from their lands in the north to Rohan in the south. It is said he would finally succeed in driving the Balkoth and the orcs from their lands. He also defended against Dunlending attacks from the north. Unlike the Easterlings, the Dunlendings' hostility is not directly rooted in loyalty to Sauron. The Dunlendings, some of whom had settled in the Ring of Isengard and mingled with the Gondorians once stationed there, viewed the Rohirrim as usurpers, for they believed they should have gotten possession of Calenarthon. Now we'll cover their history in a future video, but these men who share ancestry with the men of Bree would be a common foe to the Rohirrim. Brego would continue to explore their new land alongside his sons. On one such occasion, they would come to Harrowdale, where they discover the paths of the dead. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed, for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word, until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as if it were out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the Western tongue. The way is shut. Then they halted and looked at him and saw that he lived still, but he did not look at them. The way is shut. His voice said again, it was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut. During Brego's rule, he builds the Golden Hall of Meduseld in the city of Edoras, and makes it the new capital in 2569. The lordship of Aldburg passes to Brego's youngest son, Eofor. It would pass through his line even to the end of the Third Age, with Éomer, who would dwell there until his own ascension to the throne of Rohan. At the celebration of the completion of Meduseld, Baldur, the king's eldest son, vows to pass the Dark Door. He leaves a year later and is never seen again. Over 400 years later, while traveling the paths of the dead, Aragorn and the Grey Company find the remains of a golden-clad knight, his sword broken and notched, and his legs ruptured. The very remains of Baldur the Hapless. With Baldur's death, Brego himself would die of grief that very year, and the kingship would pass to his second son, Aldor. Aldor would become the longest-serving ruler in Rohan's history, living to 101 years old, and ruling as king for 75 years. During the reign of Aldor the Old, the population of the Rohirrim increased, and the Harrowdale, along with other valleys in the White Mountains, are settled by his people. The remaining Dunlendings east of the Eisen River are either driven out of Rohan or subdued. Because of his father's long lifespan, Aldor's son Freya is 75 years old when he becomes the 4th king of Rohan. While his 14-year reign is remarkably short, it is one of noted peace and prosperity, which would pass through the reign of his grandson. Freya dies in 2659, passing the kingship to his son Freyawain, who is already over the age of 60. Freyawain rules for 21 years before his death. There are some claims that will come about over 100 years later that Freyawain had other descendants than his son Goldwine. These descendants were rumored to have mingled with the Dunlendings, and it is from these people and rumors that a threat would later come to Rohan. After Freyawain's death in 2699, Goldwine becomes the 7th king of Rohan. Once again, the new king is over 60 years old when taking the crown, and his rule of 19 years is one of relative peace. Events in Rohan would, however, begin to turn during the rule of Goldwine's son Deor. His reign would see raids upon the lands of Rohan originating from the area near Isengard. In 2710, the king leads an expedition to the north, where they find and defeat a host of Dunlendings. They also discover that Isengard is held not by a garrison loyal to Gondor, but a hostile force of Dunlendings. Having control of an impenetrable fortress, this enemy force cannot be driven out or defeated. Unfortunately for Rohan, Gondor at this time is experiencing a renewed war with orcs in the south, meaning Steward Elgamoth is unable to send aid to reclaim the Gondorian structure. Thus, the king instead stations a strong force of Rohirrim cavalry in the north of the West Fold, hoping to deter any further hostile action. This protection, however, would only do so much, for beginning in 2718, the reign of Deor's son, Gram, is one of warfare with the Dunlendings, who continue to raid the Rohirrim. After Deor's death in 2741, his son Helm comes to power in Edoras. 13 years into his rule, a Rohirrim lord who is both rich and powerful is part of the councils of King Helm. Freka is believed to be descended from both Rohirrim and Dunlendings. Freka is not fully trusted by Helm, and only attends councils when it pleases him. At one such council in 2754, Freka comes with a host of men from his fortress in the lands around the Adorn. He requests the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wolf, to which Helm scoffs, making fun of Freka's weight. Freka falls into a rage, saying, "Old kings that refuse a proffered staff may fall on their knees." After the council, Helm stands and puts his hand upon Freka's shoulder, saying the king does not permit brawls in his house, but men are freer outside. Helm, with Freka, who had also claimed to be a descendant of King Freyawain, went outside for a private chat, where Helm proclaims, "Now, Dunlending," said the king, "you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freka, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust upon him, he breaks it. So!" With that, he smote Freka such a blow with his fist that he fell back stunned, and died soon after. Helm then proclaimed Freka's son and near kin the king's enemies, and they fled. For at once Helm sent many men riding to the west marches. It is likely that Helm's punch of Freka, resulting in the latter's death, is what earned him the name Hammerhand. While Freka's men would leave Edoras, they would return 4 years later in great force. In 2758, the Dunlendings, reinforced by the corsairs of Umbar, who had launched attacks throughout the coast of Gondor, launch an invasion of Rohan. Helm leads the Rohirrim in a battle at the crossings of Eisen, but are defeated and forced to withdraw to the Soothburg. The Dunlendings and Southrons overrun the lands of Rohan, laying siege to the Soothburg and sacking the capital of Edoras. Wolf kills Helm's son, Prince Haleth, and takes the throne in the Golden Hall, claiming the kingship of Rohan. Helm's second son, Hama, was with him, trapped in the Soothburg during the ensuing long winter. an especially cold and harsh winter that would see many lives lost in both Rohan and the Shire. Sometime after Yule, Howe would lead a group out of the Soothburg to find food for the starving Rohirrim in the fortress. However, they would be lost to the snow and never return. The king would grow gaunt from both grief and famine, but would still find a way to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies and enact some level of vengeance. It is said the dread of Helm Hammerhand alone was worth many men in the defense of the burg. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow troll into the camps of his enemies, and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon would bite on him. The Dunlending said that if he could find no food, he ate men. That tale lasted long in Dunland. Helm had a great horn, and soon it was marked that before he sallied forth, he would blow a blast upon it that echoed in the deep. And then so great a fear fell on his enemies that instead of gathering to take him or kill him, they fled away down the Coombe. After one of these nighttime raids, during which his men heard the horn, Helm did not return. The following morning, the Rohirrim discovered their king was dead. There stood Helm, dead as a stone, but his knees were unbent. Yet men said that the horn was still heard at times in the deep, and the wraith of Helm would walk among the foes of Rohan and kill men with fear. Thus, the first line of the kings of Rohan comes to an end. Their rightful heir to the throne is now Freyolf, sister son of King Helm. Freyolf was among a group of Rohirrim who, in the aftermath of the Dunlending invasion, took refuge in Dunharrow. As spring finally comes to Rohan, Freyolf leads a daring surprise raid against the Dunlending-occupied Edoras. Freyolf avenges his uncle and cousins, killing the usurper Wolf and reclaiming the capital. Freyolf claims his rightful place as king, and with Gondor now able to send aid, they clear the Dunlendings from Rohan, reclaiming the lands of their fathers. It is in the aftermath of this long-fought ordeal, and at the very coronation of Freyolf, that the wizard Saruman comes to Rohan. He brings gifts and lavishes praise for the valor of the Rohirrim. He then offers to take up residence in Isengard. Freyolf and Steward Baron of Gondor agree to this proposition, seeing the immense value in having a powerful ally at Rohan's northern border, protecting it from a second Dunlending conquest. Though in time, this move would come at a cost, for the wizard Saruman had plans of his own. Freyolf would be king when Saruman would come to dwell in Isengard. And while this would, for a time, aid Rohan in their struggle with the Dunlendings, the deal would eventually turn sour. Freyolf would reign until his death in 2798. His son is Brita, who inherits a Rohan still recovering from the war with the Dunlendings. He continues his father's ways of helping those in need, leading him to be called Leofa, meaning beloved. Still, his reign would not be without hostilities. In addition to the western borders still seeing minor conflict with the Dunlendings, they would see new enemies from the north. In the aftermath of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs ending in 2799, orcs of the Misty Mountains flee south and attempt to populate the White Mountains south of Rohan. We are told that Brita would fight these new foes, and by the time of his death 43 years later, Rohan was believed to be free of orcs. In 2780, Brita's son Walda takes the throne as the 12th king of Rohan. He had fought in his father's army in defeating the orcs, and despite what was believed, there were indeed orcs remaining in Rohan. After ruling for just 9 years, Walda is killed by orcs in the mountains near Dunharrow. Folka, his son, would become the king in that year of 2851. Known as a great hunter, Folka would avenge his father, purging the lands of Rohan of the orcs. Having rid the country of its last orcs 13 years into his reign, we are told Folka rides to hunt the great boar of Everholt in the Firian Wood. We are told nothing else about this mysterious beast, except that Folka is successful, though he receives a mortal wound from the boar's tusks and dies at the age of 60. Thus, Folka's son Folkwyne becomes the 14th king in 2864. During his reign, both Gondor and Rohan would fulfill their alliance. Gondor would send aid to Folkwyne, and they would successfully drive out the Dunlendings, who had taken control of the area between the Adorn and the Isen. Later, in 2885, Folkwyne fulfills the Oath of Eorl, sending many Rohirrim to aid Gondor against the Haradrim. The Haradrim had been stirred by emissaries of Sauron to invade Gondor. While the South Kingdom is victorious, Folkwyne's twin sons, Folkred and Fastred, are killed near the crossings of Poros in Ithilien. They are buried in Rohirrim tradition near the place of their death. The mound is called Hauth en Gwanur, the Mound of the Brothers. It marked the southern border of the realm, and it is said the enemies of Gondor were afraid to pass the tomb. With the death of his eldest sons, Folkwyne would be succeeded by his youngest child, Fengel, in 2903. Unfortunately, due to the death of his brothers, Fengel grows up spoiled by his father, and as a grown man, he would be known for his greed and love of gold. He was often at strife with his marshals and his children. This leads his youngest child, a son named Thengel, to leave Rohan entirely, going instead to live in Gondor. There he would win great renown in the service of Steward Turgon. Thengel would meet and marry a woman of Gondor named Morwen of Lesarnach, descended from the line of the princes of Dol Amroth. Together they would have 5 children, a son, Theoden, a daughter, Theodwyn, and 3 other unnamed daughters. When Fengel dies in 2953, Thengel is called upon to return to Rohan, and though reluctant, he returns home and takes his place as king. In this very year, Saruman, having taken part in the final meeting of the White Council, returns once and for all to Isengard, beginning to fortify it. In the following year, Saruman begins to work against Rohan, encroaching on its borders and supporting its enemies. Roughly 4 years into Thengel's reign, a man named Thorongil arrives from the north and enters his service. He would ride with the king for some time, before answering the call for aid from Steward Ecthelion II and leaving for Gondor. Decades later, Thorongil would return to fight alongside Thengel's son, though now using his rightful name of Aragorn. In his youth, Theoden would not only become familiar with the common speech and Rohanese, but also the elven tongue of Sindarin, for Thengel had learned it while in Gondor. Thengel dies at the age of 75 in 2980, passing his role to Theoden, who becomes the 17th king of Rohan when he is 32. The rule of Theoden would be one marked with loss and war, yet also victory and valor. 23 years into his rule, Theoden's beloved sister Theodwyn and her husband Eomund died. Theoden, who is raising his son Theodred as a single father, adopts Theodwyn's children Éomer and Éowyn, raising them as his own. 12 years later, Theoden's health begins to fail. As he was 66 years old at the time, it could have been seen as natural causes. However, it would later be revealed that through the treachery of Grima Wormtongue, Saruman was poisoning the king. With Grima continuing to manipulate the king, Saruman uses both orcs and Dunlendings to raid Rohan in an effort to weaken and eventually conquer the realm. Theodred is killed in the first battle of the Fords of Isen on February 25, 3019, a death which was the primary objective of Saruman's forces in the attack. Saruman and Grima knew that their greatest obstacles to conquering Rohan were Theodred and Éomer, both of whom were fiercely loyal to the king and were loved greatly by him. Theodred and Éomer are in the important roles of second and third marshal of the Riddermark, respectively. According to tradition, the 3 marshals of Rohan were the top 3 military leaders of the realm. Theoden would take on the role of first marshal himself, being in charge of mustering their armies for war. However, when Theoden's health began to decline, Grima ensured that the role was not filled, so that none other than the king could order a full muster of the Rohirrim. After Theodred's death, Theoden orders Éomer not to hunt orcs crossing Rohan. However, Éomer disobeys this order, destroying the band of Uruks carrying Merry and Pippin toward Isengard. Grima is able to order the arrest and imprisonment of Éomer due to his actions, and his greatest obstacles are nearly completely dealt with. And Rohan is effectively left with no marshals to lead them. However, on March 2nd, Gandalf the White would arrive in Edoras and heal the king. Theoden restores his nephew as his rightful heir, and would lead the Rohirrim toward the Fords of Isen to take the battle to Saruman. However, en route they are warned that Erkenbrand's host had been defeated at the Second Battle of the Fords of Isen, and are forced to retreat. An army of 10,000 orcs and Dunlendings was now making their way south through Rohan. Theoden leads his people to the ancient fortress where Helm Hammerhand had met his end. The area is now known as Helm's Deep, and the fortress is named the Hornburg, after Helm's horn which he sounded while hunting his enemies. In the ensuing Battle of the Hornburg, the Rohirrim would fight valiantly against the invaders, and Erkenbrand's host would return on the morning of March 4th with Gandalf the White, ensuring victory for Rohan. Saruman's forces are utterly destroyed by the Huorns, which had come to the lands outside the Hornburg, and his threat to Rohan is no more. After their victory, the king is known as Theoden Ednu, meaning the Renewed, having finally and completely overcome the evil of Saruman. Upon meeting Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took at Isengard, Theoden actually recognizes their race, calling them Holbitla, which is Old English for Hole Dweller. He is familiar with hobbits through the folklore of his people, and remembers the tale that they would spout smoke from their mouths, a reference perhaps to their love of pipeweed. While initially puzzling as to how the Rohirrim of all free folk would be familiar with the hobbits, the answer comes from the early days of their two races. For when the eotheod had dwelt in the upper Vales of Anduin, there was a race of Stoor hobbits living in the Vales of Anduin near Gladden Fields. No doubt this would be a likely time for the horsemen to come across the Holbitla. 5 days later, Theoden comes to Dunharrow, and on that very day he receives a messenger from Gondor. The errand writer, Hirgon, presents to Theoden the Red Arrow, delivering Steward Denethor's request to bring all the Rohirrim as quickly as possible to Minas Tirith. The following day, Theoden would lead 6,000 riders as they begin their journey to Minas Tirith, leaving the lands of Rohan behind them. En route to Gondor, they are made aware of a host of orcs upon the road from Minas Tirith. Coming to the Druidan forest, Theoden meets with the leader of the Woses, also known as the Druidine, Gon Burigan. Gon offers to guide the Rohirrim on long-abandoned and forgotten roads through the forest. He realizes that should Gondor be saved, the orcs will be driven off, but he also declares that should Rohan be victorious, they will leave the wild men alone in the woods and not hunt them like beasts anymore. Theoden quickly agrees to this arrangement, and we are left with no further detail on the history between the Druidine and the Rohirrim. When this hunting might have taken place in Rohan's history, whether it was a case of mistaken identity like the dwarves and elves thousands of years earlier, or really any details, we can only guess. As we know, the Rohirrim would arrive at the Pelennor Fields and would indeed help turn the tide of battle, fulfilling the oath of Eorl once again. Theoden is mortally wounded by the Witch King, and after Merry and Éowyn destroy the Witch King, a new king of Rohan would rise. With the death of Theodred and now Theoden, the second line of the kings of Rohan is ended, and the third line begins with Éomer, the 18th king of Rohan. Having lost his uncle and seemingly his sister upon the battlefield, Éomer flies into a rage, shouting death and ride to ruin and the world's ending. Just as the king loses hope at the sign of ships approaching Gondor, Aragorn's banner is unfurled, and the two leaders would ride to victory. While Éowyn would be healed in the Houses of Healing, Éomer would once again ride with Aragorn into battle, this time at the Black Gate of Mordor. Returning to Gondor victorious, Éomer and his people would witness the coronation of King Elessar on May 1st, 3019. 1 week later, he renews the Oath of Eorl with Aragorn, the two kings pledging the friendship of their realms forever. That same day, he and Éowyn would leave to return to Edoras, for there was much to set in order after so many battles. Éomer returns to Minas Tirith on July 18th, leaving the following day to bear Theoden's body back to Edoras. On August 10th, Theoden is laid to rest in the mounds outside the city. Éowyn is betrothed to Faramir, and along with her brother, she gives Meriadoc Brandybuck the Rohirric name Holdwine, meaning loyal friend. They would also gift him an ancient Horn of the Mark, which dates back to their people's days as the eotheod in the Vales of Anduin. Éomer would do away with the roles of second and third marshals, and instead creates a marshal position for each half of Rohan. Erkenbrand becomes Marshal of the West Mark, and Elfhelm becomes Marshal of the East Mark. It was said that before the White Tree of Gondor could grow in peace, many enemies would need to be conquered. Thus, Éomer would often fulfill the Oath of Eorl, riding with Aragorn to subdue the remnants of Sauron's followers in the east and south. The King of Rohan would be known as Éomer Eadig, meaning the Blessed, for it is during his rule that Rohan would recover from the hurts of war and become plentiful and prosperous once more. In 3021, Éomer marries the daughter of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Together, Éomer and Lothiriel would have a son, Elfwine the Fair. During the reign of Éomer, Rohan would welcome an entirely new race of people to those lands, dwarves. Gimli, who had been in awe of the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, returns with a contingent of dwarves, and with the permission of the king, founds a new colony. The dwarves would have a great friendship with both Rohan and Gondor, and Gimli would become the first Lord of the Glittering Caves. In total, Éomer would rule Rohan for 65 years, second longest of any king in the history of their country. Prior to his death in the 63rd year of the Fourth Age, he would be visited once again by Merry and Pippin. Upon his death, Elfwine becomes the 19th king of Rohan. The last king listed in Tolkien's writings, Elfwine is left a realm in a far more peaceful and prosperous position than the home of the Horse Lords had seen in many long years. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.